All right. How much time do you want me to start with? Because I can expand and contract depending on how much time we want to leave for. No, I'm just kidding. Do you want me to just give the first? All right. So first, I want to thank the Shanker Institute for inviting me to do this. I have had the opportunity to tell the story of how the St. Paul Federation of Teachers has used collective bargaining to a lot of different audiences. And one, I actually never get tired of thinking of providing a new lens, having new visions for collective bargaining, rethinking collective bargaining, and that actually comes from a place of really what I attempted to do myself at the bargaining table and what we as a union work to do at the collective bargaining table. And it really started with a very first initial, very traditional experience at a collective bargaining table in 2005 when I was on my first bargaining team. And there was this implicit agreement that I had learned was not really exclusive to St. Paul, but it sort of evolved over time at collective bargaining tables. The implicit agreement was you don't come to the table asking for too much, and we won't come to the table asking for too much either. And while that sometimes made bargaining efficient, and it sometimes made the topics we discussed dry, it meant there was a lot of housekeeping, discussions around should there be a comma here, or did we mean to have that be two sentences? It also meant that a lot of the problems we needed to tackle as teachers and paraprofessionals and a school district, quite frankly, were left to be discussed somewhere else. And it left me fairly dissatisfied when it seemed like the issues that were really driving me, that were motivating me, animating me, and my union, the issues I felt like we were talking about, certainly included the sort of contract that allowed us to own a home in the community in which we worked. Absolutely. And at the same time, what I found myself talking with members about in parking lots and, after the staff meeting where the real agenda got discussed and things were issues that members seemed more vital. Right? They were issues of attracting and retaining a diverse teaching force. They were issues of what school budget cuts were doing to what we were able to provide to students. Having this brief moment of expanding a school's arts and music program to include multiple choirs, as well as a band and an orchestra, to 2 years later having to contract that and deciding which music our students would get. Well, just down the street, the other school was deciding whether students actually got music or art. We had to make those sorts of choices. And these were also the topics agitating our members in St. Paul that consumed membership meetings. And I thought, if our most powerful opportunity to shape our working conditions is at the collective bargaining table, then why wouldn't we want our contract to be the most powerful document our district had to attract and retain a diverse workforce? And why wouldn't we want our contract to be the agreement a public school has with its community for the sort of school experience all of our students deserve? And that really set us off on a path to start bringing up new issues, bring this new vision of collective bargaining to the bargaining table, where we absolutely wanted to make sure our members could afford to own a home in the community in which they worked. We absolutely wanted to make sure that our members had access to the sort of health care that was not going to bankrupt them or cause them a second mortgage or some of those disasters you hear around more exploited workers. And at the same time, our members were deeply distraught over the sort of choices they were being asked to make. Right? Do you want your school nurse for 3 hours a week, or would you prefer to have the school social worker those extra 3 hours a week? Right? And these were ridiculous choices. And so we set about to take advantage actually of a state law in Minnesota that recognizes collective bargaining of public employees as open meetings, as a public meeting. And so anyone could come watch. Now, historically, no one would. And again, when you think of that historic sort of implicit agreement at a bargaining table, you would think there are probably 100 other things you could do with your time and then balance your checkbook before you'd want to watch someone negotiate over, are you going to get 2.5% or will we get 2.5% or will we get 2.25% at the top? And, you're sitting in the audience, you don't know what the top means, and you don't know what, let's line out that, that line on the contract. And so we decided to actually start inviting people to watch us negotiate. And so in 2009, we brought in, we started with just our members in general. And knowing that we really needed to address special education issues, we started with special education members specifically, saying, come, here are our goals in special education. Come watch us negotiate. And we got to a point actually in 2009, one meeting where the bargaining team physically left the table, were replaced by 6 special education members to do the bargaining that night. And we literally sat behind them while we had 70 plus special education teachers and paraprofessionals and parents sitting behind us to negotiate. The wins that year were modest, but it was a great way for us to see that our members were a huge asset. The parents of the special education students who shared their experiences with us were a huge asset in coming up with better contract language than we would have just as a bargaining team of 6. Right? I mean, the old adage, 2 heads are better than 1, clearly is exponentially true when you bring more people into coming up with the best contract language to meet the needs of your student population. And so after dipping our foot in the pool in 2009, when we came up to 2011, we decided we actually wanted a contract action team, that in engaging our members, our special education teachers and paraprofessionals gave us great feedback about being involved in that sliver of the process in 2009. And so we decided to go forward with a contract action team. And it was a noble experiment. We weren't exactly sure what a contract action team was, but we knew we wanted one. And we knew we wanted them to be a conduit for information, for them to both tell members back at school what was happening at the negotiating table, and then to tell those of us who were negotiators, who of course couldn't be at every school in the district, what they were hearing about our negotiation items at the school level. And that year we ended up with about 24 people who said they were interested in this contract action team that we sort of built while we were negotiating. And we found members who were interested in coming to negotiations. We found members who were interested in going back and forth. And at the same time, they were still issues that we, the bargaining team, had designed ourselves. And so inviting members of the community and members of our contract negotiation team, or our contract action team, into negotiations, we were certainly for the first time tackling very ambitious ideals of class size, special education caseload, as well as introducing plans and proposals for improving the longitudinal effort our district had made in diversifying the teaching force, but improving and sustaining that work as well. And we ended up with a successful negotiation period, getting our first ever contract language around class size, getting language around special education caseloads, and agreements there. And we were really proud of that. And so as we moved forward into 2013, we realized, though, one of the last pieces of that sort of traditional negotiation style we had held on to was that they were still all of our ideas. We had certainly asked, we had been very open with the community saying, would you please support our contract language, our proposed contract language around class size. Would you please support this language around special education caseloads? And again, asking parents who felt very affected by, my daughter has 47 students in her algebra class, or, my son's second grade is 34 students large, or, this kindergarten class is 32 students large. So we had lots of first person narratives we could bring to the table, and we had opportunities for parents and students to speak at the table. But when you got down to it, they were still the ideas we had based on our surveys with our members and based on things we were hearing. We had done our best work at shaping ourselves. And so a couple things happened in between the ratifying the 2011 agreement and the 2013 agreement, which is detailed in the dissent article. And one of those things that happened was actually President Randy Weingarten asked me to go on a trip to Finland that she had been invited to but couldn't go to. And of course, by then I had heard so much about Finland and their school system. And it was a transformational opportunity to see it sort of come out of Pasi Sahlberg's Finnish lessons and, right in front of me. And, to sort of see the intentionality around bringing children together at the preschool level and the responsibilities given to preschool children to shape their experience and practice responsibility. In this one, as a middle school English teacher, this was not lost on me. The preschool students taking so much responsibility for setting the table and clearing the table at lunchtime, then going into a middle school classroom and seeing middle school students completely serve themselves, and so the food service professionals setting everything out and having them completely serve themselves and then completely clean up after themselves. And then as a mom of two teenagers at that time, I was like, this is outstanding. And how do I just become, president of a union in Finland and have my kids go to school here? But just as one example of the intentionality of interconnecting, and then hearing about their special education system and how by the time children graduate from school in Finland, how half of them have had some sort of touch point with their special education system because and sometimes it's episodic. But they see this as this broad umbrella of meeting the needs of students. And so sometimes it was very temporary and it was perhaps a 6-week accommodation. And sometimes it was an accommodation that lasted quite a bit of time because it was a permanent disability you were addressing to meet the needs of students. And how because of that, because so many students had experience with accommodations, whether they be episodic or long-term, that there was no stigma around it. And there was such varied support that all of these ideas started, and I thought, there is no reason we need to wait as a union for our state or our federal government to sort of recreate Finland. We have the power at our collective bargaining table to recreate these conditions right now, or, in 4 months when we open negotiations. And the other thing I realized as well was that we had asked, we had asked our members to shape our conditions, but as all of you probably in this audience know, the dominant narrative surrounding us as teachers, even as we were trying to introduce language around peer assistance and review and introduce language to diversify our own profession and then support and retain diverse professionals, the dominant narrative around us was one of, teachers and their unions only bring a deficit to a school system. And, and there were conversations around whether it was around due process rights or tenure rights or conversations around seniority rights and all of these things seen as a deficit. And I thought, if the community is really talking about our contract and laws that affect us, then let's ask the community what should be in our contract. And then I realized what came out of my mouth. And I thought, am I ready for this? Am I ready to hear? I hear what the community says when they talk about us. Am I ready to hear what the community says when they talk directly to me? And I realized that that's exactly what I wanted to have happen. I was done having people talk about what our condition should be. I was ready to hear them say it to me. I was ready to solve those problems together. And so, at the same time, the AFT was launching a series of community meetings across the country for a variety of reasons, and was really was really masterful at mentoring me, whether it was Randy or other AFT staff members and other AFT leaders from across the country, mentoring me on how to authentically engage with a community, again, in a new way. And that being a way of mutual power and mutual partnership, and not in a traditional charitable fashion, right? Where we're not just going to raise money for the food shelf in November, but we're going to spend the other 11 months of the year figuring out how we put food shelves in our community out of business because no one will need them anymore, right? And so, really helping us rethink what that community engagement looks like came at the perfect time. Right? Or my idea came at the perfect time. And so we actually used the mentoring that AFT was offering us around community engagement and held a series of listening sessions around our community. And we asked 3 basic questions to get us started. The first question was, what are the schools St. Paul children deserve? The second question was, and who are the teachers St. Paul children deserve? And the third question was, and then what is the profession those teachers deserve? And we just started conversations with those 3 questions, and we trained our members and some allies to be listeners and facilitators at those. We collected all of this information. We also tried to hold listening. We asked our own building stewards and contract action team members that had become definitely a much more sophisticated operation than when we first introduced it. We'd ask them to hold their own listening sessions if they would. I held a listening session with our future educators of St. Paul at Como High School, which was a fabulous conversation. 2 hours of a couple dozen high school students telling me about envisioning the schools they deserve and the teachers they deserve and the profession they were thinking about, they were exploring entering, the sort of profession they deserved. It was, I could have spent all week there listening to them because they were so brilliant. And so we compiled all of this information that people came together with, and we actually hired a community leader to be our master facilitator, so that people felt like they weren't telling Mary Cathryn Ricker what they thought she wanted to hear. They were actually this community leader who was a retired professor at Hamline University. She was also a lawyer, longstanding community leader, as well as a professional development expert on diversifying the workforce, on confronting racism and racist practices, and becoming a more inclusive world. So she was masterful at facilitating this process for us, and then also crunching what she saw coming in from all of these listening sessions. And so that happened. We launched this in November of 2013. That happened through January or February of 2013. At the same time we're holding these listening sessions, we are assembling our bargaining team. And we're telling them that this time we're not coming up with the ideas. This time we are co-creating it. So don't join the bargaining team if you think you have your one thing you wanted to come to negotiate, right? And that was changing the hockey coach salary. And that's it. Because that's not what we're doing at the table this time. I have a great respect for hockey coaches. But we were going to do a community designed process. And so then in February, as we started to see the issues that were coming up from this community listening session process, we surveyed our members on the issues that were coming up. And instead of that traditional survey of members where, there are lots of different ways to survey members, right? You you tell them, say you have $100, how would you spend it on these 90 issues that we could bring to the bargaining table, right? That's one way. You could also do rank these issues from 1 to 90, 1 being your most important issue, 90 being the issue you don't care if we address or not. And then there's also your traditional Likert scale of rate these issues 1 to 5, right? 1 or 5 being the most important, depending on how you design your scale. Well, so we designed our survey instead to be a Likert scale of actions, right? And so ours were rank these issues, from would you be willing to wear a button to win this, all the way to would you be willing to strike? And with different tactics in between, right? And different tactics that were escalating to really get a feel for how passionately do people really care about class size. That was one of the issues. How passionately do people really care if we address art and music and physical education and world languages in our contract? Those were the sorts of issues that were bubbling up. And so in the meantime, so in February, we got that back. In March, we went back out to the community, again, with these issues that had really been raised frequently. And we said, did we get this right? Are these the issues that really feel like are priorities for you as parents and students and community leaders who want a strong public school system? And we got their feedback on that. And we polished that up. And then at April, we brought the top 7 issues to our executive board and said to the executive board, we had the community members presenting each of the 7 issues, saying that this is what came from the process. And we had the executive board had a moment then to decide whether our priorities were going to be adopted from this community engagement process or whether the executive board wanted to design them themselves. And that night, our executive board voted overwhelmingly to adopt these community engaged issues as the priorities for the negotiating table. And then the very next motion was to turn and direct all 3 of our bargaining teams to negotiate from these priorities. And in May, we launched, so this is May of 2013, excuse me. We launched our negotiation session that first week in May, and we presented, if I recall correctly, 27 issues based on those 7 priorities that came from the negotiating table. And in the 3rd week of May, the district came back and said all but 7 were not subject to negotiations because they were not mandatory subjects of collective bargaining in our state. And so we did have to point out that they were permissive subjects of collective bargaining, which meant that we were going to have to work but these were no longer our issues. We could no longer say to the district that, these are, oh, you're right, they're permissive, they're not mandatory, because we had a whole community process that we went through to get these. They weren't just our issues. They were issues that were built with these students and these parents and our community members and our educators and our paraprofessionals all together. So to move on these issues, we were going to need everyone working together, which is exactly what we did during the course of 2013 and 2014. And I can stop there and I can talk about the actual campaign portion afterwards. Sure. But we can move to Tom's example.
Yep.
Okay.
Tom?
Thanks.